Hi, everybody. Welcome. Hello. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I just want everyone to know that we're recording this session. We've got a lot of folks who weren't able to come, and so it's going to be on the Faculty for YouTube page, which has 8 subscribers. It's a very, very hot place to be. But it will be there if you have friends who want to watch it later. But that also is so you know that whatever you say, the mic on the white box is picking it up. My name is Sarah Carpenter. I teach here in the Faculty of Education. I've seen many of you at F4P events before. We decided and have been working with SJP to organize some teach-ins on helping us to understand quite a bit of the complexity around the investment structure that occupation. We had a workshop last winter where we were like, what are investments? And what are financial instruments? And what is this whole language that in order to do divestment, we need to understand? Over the summer, there was a report that came out from the UN, from Francesca Albanese's office on the economy of genocide and occupation. And so we have asked Professor Rob Aiken from the Department of Political Science, who teaches courses on this stuff, understands it, come and spend some time with us and help us to understand it. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 and Métis Region 4, and we are here to talk about settler colonial capitalism. And we're not here to talk about it just over there. We're here to understand how it all ties together as a global system. And I was thinking about this, and I was sort of thinking about what is it that brings us together. And Rob has been in divestment struggles around climate change for many years and does research in this area. And we've always tried to add to our discourse on campus that Palestine is about climate change as well, right? And so I was just rereading. Has everyone got a copy of this little book? I highly recommend this little book, Resisting Erasure, Capital, Imperialism, and Race in Palestine by Adam Hanieh, Robert Knox, and Rafeef Ziadah. And they're trying to do this work for us to understand these connectivities. And it's not even that long or a normal size book to read. My grad students call me Sarah, read the book Carpenter, because they always want short things. And this is small.
Magpie Books has it.
Magpie Books has it. There you go. But I wanted to read a couple paragraphs to you and then turn it over to Rob. So they say, we have emphasized the basic link between the dispossession of Palestinians and the politics of the wider Middle East region. Such an approach posits the struggle for Palestinian liberation not only as a confrontation with Israel, but also a challenge to the broader architecture of regional power. This is why Palestine has always been so fundamental to political movements across the Middle East. Conversely, it is why the fate of Palestine is intimately bound up with the successes and setbacks of other struggles in the region. These regional dynamics are a result of the Middle East's pivotal role in our oil-centered capitalist world. The Gulf states, in close partnership with Western oil giants, are doubling down on hydrocarbon production, locking the planet into a trajectory of certain climate catastrophe. For the US, this deepening fossil fuel expansion, tied to its strategic alliance with the Gulf monarchies and their normalization of Israel, is a crucial source of power at a time when American global dominance faces mounting challenges. There can be no dismantling of the fossil order, nor any genuine Palestinian liberation without breaking apart these alliances. This is why Palestine is at its core a struggle against fossil fuel capitalism, and why the extraordinary battle for survival waged by Palestinians today in Gaza and beyond is inseparable from the fight for the future of the planet. In order to do that, we have to understand this capitalism-colonialism nexus. And so, Rob, here to help us a bit. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a quote now has me thinking about a lot of things. Tall word, but thank you all for having me here. It's really exciting to be with this group because I go out of my research and is thinking about the politics of financial markets, and my key contention there is that those markets, like the big point of departure for my research and teaching is those markets, like financial institutions, financial spaces, need public accountability. that for far too long we've just sort of ceded those spaces to technical experts that they can only be knowable by financial accountants or auditors or investment analysts, when in fact their impacts are so important publicly. So it's really exciting to be in a room with people who are thinking about the politics of divestment, because that really excites me. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So I'm going to just speak for about 25 minutes and then and turn it over to you. But at any time, please interrupt me if you have a question or a comment or want to just talk. It's really happy to have you have a conversation. What I want to do is really just like respond, as Sarah said, to the Albanese report, which, if you've looked at it or not, it's like this really, I think, really important and like foundational report that gives us an analysis of the economic underpinning of genocide and occupation in Palestine. So it's really an attempt to think like, what are the economics that underpin this, or as she puts it in the report, what is the corporate machinery that both enables the genocide, but also benefits from it, profits from it, generates value from it. And that's the really, key important thing that I've been thinking about. And even though, I do want to acknowledge that report is really, like, I'm really excited that report is circulating and causing debate. I also think there are ways that we could just expand on it. And so I'm just going to say a few things about how we might just like deepen our thinking about what it means to like politicize a corporate structure in this kind of moment of financial capitalism. So it's like just building productively on that report. And this comes, I should say, and Sarah kind of like hinted at this in her introduction, like it comes a little bit in my thinking about divestment in two other contexts. So I've been thinking about a comparison between the divestment campaign targeted in Africa during the anti-apartheid movement. This was a campaign that really began in the mid-1970s and crested in the 1980s. And then I've been thinking about that in comparison to the fossil fuel divestment campaign the last 15 or so years. And there's a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences between those campaigns. And so a lot of my comments here will be thinking about how things have changed over that period of time. I should say, by the way, so yeah, I'm going to focus, I guess, in particular on this idea of a corporation, because Albanese wants to direct our attention to what she calls the corporate machinery that makes genocide possible. And corporation, just as a tiny bit of historical context here, comes from Roman law and comes from the Latin reference to the word corpus, which means a body. And so a corporation is really just a body, a legal body that's formed by individuals who want to aggregate their capital, their property, their money to accomplish something together. And so it was a way to kind of create a separate body for those who want to aggregate their capital in that way. So that meant then that a corporation is a body separate in some ways from those who create it. It can own property, it can absorb liability, it can sign contracts, just as other bodies can. And in some cases, increasingly, it has rights. And so it's important to think of like, what is a corporation and how do we hold it to account in different kinds of ways. And so I guess I want to just expand what Albanese says a little bit, because on one hand, she points to the corporate machinery that underpins genocide in Palestine. She points to the corporations that make that possible and to the profits that are generated through it. She points in particular to a whole range of different sort of well-known and not so well-known corporations that you probably already know. Like we're thinking here about Lockheed Martin, about Caterpillar, about all the other firms that make that occupation and genocide possible. But I do want to just maybe deepen her reflection on corporations here, because I think she sort of assumes that the corporation is sort of an unchanging thing, a thing that has not changed over time. And she puts the corporation in this really long-term context and reminds us that the corporation has its roots in colonial history. And that is absolutely true. Like the earliest large corporations, the earliest large international corporations were those connected to the empires, right? So thinking here about the Dutch and British East India companies, the various companies created to manage slavery in Africa. In Canada, you can think about the Hudson's Bay Company. These were all companies that were deeply connected to colonialism, made it possible, and so on. And they're still doing that, of course, in Palestine today. So I do agree with her. There's a continuity there that's really important to point out. But at the same time, if we're thinking about how to politicize corporations, we need to pay attention to the ways in which the corporation has changed or evolved over time. And so that's what I've been thinking about, because there are some ways in which over the course of the 20th century, and then even over the last 25, 30 years, the corporate form has changed. It has implications for how we might politicize it, how we might intervene into it. So this is my main theme. And there's sort of like two big changes I just want to point to that I kind of focus on in my research and teaching. The first of these changes happens really at the beginning of the 20th century with the advent of the large American corporation. Like, it's not as if there weren't large corporations that predate this, of course, and so on. But really, it's the American corporation that typifies a new kind of economic actor that has like enormous scope and enormous size. And these are the large American corporations that emerge really at the beginning of the 20th century, and they come to dominate the global economy after World War II. They become, you know, the first really global spanning multinational corporation. So think about like General Motors, General Electric, DuPont, all of the large American corporations that emerged at the same time. And they're really unique in a lot of ways. But one way they're quite unique is that they're just enormous in scope, and they have a really, really expansive and dispersed ownership. So unlike the corporation imagined in Roman law, that was like a group of people who knew each other, who would gather and create a corporate body to pool their capital to accomplish something, these large American corporations involved thousands, tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of shareholders. So the ownership of these corporations was dispersed like enormously, really, really widely. So the key example here is AT&T, which became a firm that dominated many parts of the American economy, many parts of the American infrastructure, its communication technologies, its telegraph and later telephones and radio and other things. And by 1920, it had 130,000 owners, 130,000 shareholders, which meant then that the corporation, the ownership of that corporation was spread so widely that it was no longer controlled by its owners directly. So this was a separation, the beginning of a really important change in which the owners of the corporation were separated from the managers. I mean, the corporation was still, in some indirect sense, related to and dependent on its owners, but because there were so many of them, really the corporation became governed by these technical managers. And this became a whole new way of thinking about the corporation, and it provided, it provoked challenges about how to make those corporations more amenable to public accountability and how activists could interact with them. Eventually, shareholder activists did develop really successful strategies to deal with these new large corporations, but it involved mobilizing a different kind of strategy than it had in the past. So this is like a really big development. These large American corporations, and later replicated other places as well, where management and ownership were separated. And that just meant the corporation was going to be governed differently and in some ways a little more insulated from public accountability, because the owners were no longer directing the company in the same way that smaller corporations were. But that's one big change that I think has influenced how activists think about and interact with corporations. But the really second and maybe more significant and more recent development that I think a lot about is what we call the financialization of the corporation or of the economy. That's an ugly term, I realize that, and it means that it's a very complicated term. It has a lot of different meanings. I have a course where we spend an entire semester kind of like think, what does this mean, the financialization of the economy? But for our purposes here, it just really means a kind of shift over the last maybe 30 or 40 years in the way in which economic power is organized in our societies. It really means a shift away from productive corporations to financial corporations. So a shift away from those companies that produce things like General Motors, General Electric, Caterpillar, Lockheed Martin, the firms that are mentioned in the Albanese report, and a shift away from those firms to the financial sector. So this has meant that since the 1970s, but really gathering pace in the 90s and over the last decades, much more of our economic activity is channeled through the financial sector than it was before. Much more economic wealth is held financial assets than previously seen. And the financial sector is just much more politically and economically powerful than it was previously. This doesn't mean that there are still companies that obviously produce things. Like we learned about these in the Albanese report, we learned about Caterpillar, we learned about Lockheed Martin and the way in which they're producing things that enable genocide. But those firms are entangled in the financial sector now. And so the financial part of it is a really kind of important part of this kind of story. And this means then not only has this empowered like the traditional financial sector, like banks and insurance companies and the stock markets, but we see new financial players that are really important in the economic context now. So we see, for example, the rise of new, what we call institutional investors. So the rise of like the mutual fund industry, the increasing power of pension funds, of hedge funds, but also of these what are called large asset managers. And this refers to a very small handful of enormous corporations that have concentrated a large number of financial assets. So like BlackRock is one of these. It's the largest economic organization in the world. It's probably the largest economic organization we've historically ever witnessed. Vanguard is another one of these. There's a sort of a small number, about a dozen of these very large asset managers. And these are enormous firms, enormous corporations that don't produce anything, but they hold financial assets. So they own shares in these large firms that are cataloged in the Albanese report. And their whole goal is to hold assets for the very long term and to protect return on investments. So they have a slightly different goal than productive firms like General Electric, General Motors, and so on. They're not just interested in like creating profits by selling goods and services. They want to guarantee return on investment over the long term. That's their entire kind of goal. So they're all about securing their returns for their investors. And this has like been a big change since the period of the 1980s, for example, when the South African divestment campaign was interacting more directly with productive corporations that were engaging in South Africa, although they did engage with pension funds as well at that point in time. Okay, so and I'm happy to go into more detail, but I don't want to get us bogged down in detail here. The main point I'm trying to just point out here is that we're living in a moment where financial sector is much more powerful than it was even in 1985, and certainly much more so than a century ago. So that just presents a kind of like set of questions about how to organize around the corporate machinery that underpins genocide in Palestine. I should point out that this financialization of the economy has occurred because of many different factors. One of those factors is government policy. That governments have actually helped create this condition of financialization through policies that have encouraged the deregulation of the financial sector, the liberalization of that sector, and the growth of it in many kinds of ways. That begins really in the 1970s, but really explodes in the 1990s and in the decades since. And it's created these not only these new players, like these asset managers I was talking about, but also these enormous kind of financial markets that are very hard to regulate and are sometimes quite volatile. And that even though they're the product of government policy, it's now hard for governments to manage them in some ways because they're just so enormous. It's like too big to fail kind of approach to these institutions. Okay, I guess I want to just then say a little bit about what are the implications of this shift for thinking about divestment. That's one of my interests, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it as well. I guess one of the things I kind of would point out just as a beginning point here is that in my kind of thinking and my research, it seems as though this has been an important shift that has really framed a difference between the ways in which anti-apartheid divestment activists organize their campaigns and the way in which climate activists organize their divestment campaigns more recently. And so there's been this kind of important set of shifts for a number of reasons. One of the reasons this occurs is because in a period of financialization has empowered new economic actors. And this includes really empowering fund managers, those who manage investments. So those who manage pension funds, those who manage these asset management firms I was talking about, those who manage mutual funds, other kinds of institutional investments, those who manage our university endowments, and so on. And for the most part, these fund managers over the last 2 decades have perceived themselves to be governed more in a more confined way by what we describe as fiduciary responsibility. This is simply like a legal requirement, not just common in the financial sector, but other places as well, that requires those who manage other people's assets to manage those assets in the best interest of those who are the ultimate beneficiaries. It sounds like a straightforward concept, but the way this has been interpreted over the last 20 years is that the only thing that these managers can take into account is the long-term return on those investments. So that their fiduciary responsibility to the owners of those investments requires them to, in a very narrow way, only understand what they're doing as managing for the long-term returns and managing the risk of those long-term returns. So that, yeah, return on investment over the long term is everything for these fund managers, and they often perceive themselves to be legally required to do this. This actually is an echo, if you're interested in the longer history of this, it's an echo of this famous essay written by Milton Friedman at the very beginning of the financialization period, when he argued that the only social or ethical responsibility of the firm is to maximize return to shareholders. And this is an argument that was maybe out of place when he wrote it, but now it's become a kind of dogma among those who manage these really important kind of funds, including the funds that support the corporations that are engaged in genocide in Palestine. So this, in my view, is interesting because it marks a shift, or at least a debate in the divestment community, but how to react to these big structural shifts in the economy, this move from productive to financial power, and what it means about long-term risk and so on. And so we could map out a kind of shift in strategy that marks the anti-apartheid divestment campaigns from the climate divestment campaigns. So just to oversimplify the case a little bit here, I would argue that a lot of the anti-apartheid divestment activists really used a very kind of engaged political and moral language in their analysis. They wanted to mobilize a movement that was shocked by the obvious and ugly humanitarian crimes in the apartheid regime, and they wanted to politicize anyone that profited from that. And they wanted to inject a language of ethical responsibility. And they, beginning about 1974, 1975, they were successful at various different levels in kind of building a movement, especially in the United States, that presented that kind of case. In the case of fossil fuel activists, activists who are trying to encourage divestment from fossil fuel investments, there is now, I think, a really striking debate, sometimes a bit divisive, but one that's really important, one in which a number of activists are beginning to experiment with moving beyond that language they inherited from the South African campaigns and trying to adopt a language more consistent with the financialization logic. So what some climate activists have been doing, and it's not a settled story, there are still debates and differences of strategy in different places, but there are certainly now many climate activists who are beginning to try to make a case for divestment, particularly on financial grounds. So they've abandoned the language of ethical responsibility. They've tried to abandon the language of climate justice. I mean, they still believe in that, of course, but they're just, in many cases, using the instrumental language of risk management, arguing to risk managers that your long-term investment in coal is a risk, that your long-term investment in fossil fuels is a risk to your investment, and you should divest because it violates your fiduciary responsibility to manage those funds in the best interest of the beneficiary. So this is a shift that's kind of important. It means a shift from thinking about ethical responsibility to what we would call prudential responsibility. Prudential responsibility is a fund manager whose only job is to act prudently on behalf of their investor, which means calculating rationally the risk and taking the long-term strategy that would allow them to succeed in that kind of context. Now, I guess one reason why climate activists have gone this direction is because they feel like well, they can kind of play the game with this language and try to achieve, and there have been some achievements. It's been a big part of the debate around the California Public Pension Plan divestment program, where it's one of the largest public pension funds in the United States, and it's a big investor, and there have been some successes in divestment campaigns with that fund, and they've made those gains basically by convincing asset managers that they're risking those assets by investing in climate. But there is a debate in the community because there are many activists who are concerned about getting up on the language of ethical responsibility, of climate justice, and so on. So I just want to kind of point out that shift and the context for that shift, and I think it's sort of an extension of the Albanese report, but also raises questions about like, what does divestment mean in this context? What are the best strategies that we can use to promote divestment in cases of like obvious injustice and humanitarian tragedy and so on. I mostly want to leave it there. I just want to point out, in case you're interested in a slight digression, that what lurks behind a lot of this debate is the idea of corporate personhood. So this is something, I mean, this is a complicated idea, but you might know, and it's sort of implied what I already said, like the idea of the corporation is an idea that the corporation is a body that's separate from the humans that create it, and that helps protect those humans from the liabilities in some ways. But this idea of the corporation as a body has become extended over the last number of decades, especially in the American context, so that now there's a kind of growing and extensive body of American law that, and this is growing internationally as well, that understands the corporation as a person that not only can own property, but also has rights, and including rights that protect it from political intervention. So I think behind some of this is the sense that the sense of corporate personhood, which also complicates the ways in which we might think about activist campaigns around corporations. I don't want to get too much in detail of that, but I just mention it in case anyone's interested. It's kind of a part of the discussion there. So I think I'll just stop there, if that's okay. And I'd love to hear reactions or questions and so on.
Does anybody have any clarifying questions or things they want to go back to or hear again, or need unpacked a bit more? Yeah.
I was wondering if you had more examples of, you touched on of how climate activists are doing things differently. But I was wondering about like maybe the fact that they protest banks more. There's other examples of how they protest the financial.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of this comes from the work of, if anyone knows the work of Bill McKibben, a well-known kind of green activist. He's also like an activist now in his 80s, who's also mobilized this whole like elder movements against climate injustice, and he's been at the forefront of trying to shift the climate justice movement to the financial sector. And so yes, he's not only encouraged activists to use this language where they strategically think it would succeed, but he's also encouraged them to directly confront like insurance companies that are especially insurance companies, but also banks that invest in climate injustices and so on, but especially insurance companies. He's, like it's sort of clear, and this relates to Palestine, I think, very clearly as well. It's clear that a lot of corporations that engage in risky areas, like the extraction of coal right now is sort of a high-risk area because the price of coal over the future is very uncertain. It's the most inefficient fossil fuel, and there's so much climate activism and obvious reasons to move beyond it that the extraction of coal is very risky. So it only is possible if insurers underwrite the risks of coal extraction. So McKibben and other American activists have really been targeting insurance companies who are active in the coal area. And they partly have just been saying, like, why would you, I mean, there's an injustice issue here, but why would you underwrite this risk? It's a really big risk, and trying to encourage those who have an interest in insurance companies to think about that risk. And I mentioned that, I mean, so thank you for raising that point. There are lots of ways in which the climate justice movements are tackling the financial sector, but this insurance issue is important for Palestine as well, because the corporations that Albanese documents that are intervening and profiting from and enabling genocide in Israel, Palestine, are engaging in risky corporate behavior. And so they always rely on insurers to underwrite that risk. So for example, we know like there's been some British activists who've tried to document the British insurers who are active in Palestine. I think they have a list now of a couple dozen. It's hard to do that research because a lot of it is not accessible, but they do know that there's liability insurance that has been extended to some of the largest players in Israel, Palestine, some of the largest military suppliers and so on. And so they've begun to try to develop campaigns that would target insurance companies, because without those insurance companies, some of those corporations would not be able to operate. The risk would be too high for them, and they wouldn't be able to justify that risk without insurance companies that would help underwrite that risk. So insurance has always been a big key part of this, and this this is long-standing. Like the history of insurance is one in which every kind of incidents of colonialism and genocide requires the work of insurers. Like there's a long history, a deep history of the slave trade, for example, that documents the ways in which insurance companies underwrote the risk of slavery. Without insurance companies spreading that risk around, absorbing that risk, transferring and selling that risk, the slave trade would not have been as long and as damaging and as violent as it was. So I think the insurance sector is one here that's really pivotal to all these cases, and it's one that McKibben has really helped steer direction towards in the climate justice area. And I think some of the Israel-Palestine activists are beginning to take that up as well. So that's one area where I think it's kind of important.
Like the case of the Zong.
Yeah, that Zong is a
Oh, the
case there.
history of the Zong.
Oh.
Zong was a transatlantic slave ship that in its voyage, it was in the 1790s, I think.
Yeah.
In its voyage, decided that it didn't want to spend the money to feed the people that it had kidnapped. And so it threw, I think, 300 or 400 people overboard, and then made an insurance claim when it got back to England. And the insurance corporation took the owner of the Zong to court and said, this isn't lost cargo, you murdered them. You disposed of your cargo, and so I'm not liable for your claim. And it was one of the big court cases. They got so much public attention about the inhumanity of the conditions of the slave ships that it shifted public discourse. But it was essentially a civil litigation between an insurer and a corporation.
And it sort of reveals the way in which, no one's prepared to manage that risk on their own. So the insurers were vital. But it was also a case that it's instructive because it was a case that also was very important to the abolitionist movement. It really sparked a renewal of the abolitionist kind of movement. So again, a key moment where a politicized financial kind of episode results in this kind of anti-colonial activism. The Zong is a great example of that.
Other questions, comments, thoughts, concerns?
There's a lot to process.
I have a question about, so in the Albanese report, there are discussions of producers, right? People that companies that produce things like, say, Caterpillar, that are then used to in the occupation and genocide. And then one of your stories, the story you told us too, was about how the shift from production to financialization and how that will impact political organizing around asset managers are more insulated and more dependent on risk questions. But I'm also wondering about how does that financialization affect like the day-to-day production, of things? Like, does that also factor into what becomes profitable? I don't know if that question makes sense. I'm just trying to think about the production and financialization as entwined and not just distinct.
Well, the whole thing's kind of absurd, so it's hard to make sense of it. But in the case of your point, so Caterpillar is the example here because it's one of the firms that we know is so deeply implicated for a long time, is implicated in occupation and genocide. Basically, the way relationship would work is that like one of the large asset managers, probably all the asset managers, I haven't done this, but we could hold a stake in Caterpillar. Because all the large public corporations actually really want to attract capital from these asset managers, because when those asset managers invest in them, it's a signal to the market that they think this is a good long-term kind of bet. So and that doesn't affect Caterpillar's day-to-day capital availability, right? Because they're just buying some existing stock that someone else owned. But it does signal to the market that this is like a good long-term prudential kind of move. And so that bolsters Caterpillar's share price. And in this era of financialization, the share price is more or less everything that the corporation wants to signal. They're really dependent on showing result every quarter. This is the other thing about financial. It's a very short-term kind of reporting structure. They report to the stock markets every quarter. And reports can impact their share price, and they want to maintain their share price. And so the asset managers, when they invest or they move away from someone, is a really important signal. So it doesn't impact their day-to-day like productive activity, but they're very preoccupied by it because they want to earn the signal from the asset managers that. And so they often will negotiate with these asset managers. They will meet with them. You know, how do you think we're performing? What could we do? Like they really want to cultivate the support of these. So these asset managers are quite powerful in that sense. But on a day-to-day level, it doesn't necessarily impact its opportunity. It's, you know, what they're doing. The question becomes like politically how to intervene in Caterpillar. Is it intervening directly with Caterpillar, or is it intervening with the asset manager? Like if the asset manager withdrew from Caterpillar, that would be a significant harm for Caterpillar. Like they would feel that because they've just lost the trust of these big kind of price-setting players. But that's a hard thing to do, obviously. Okay, so I'm not sure if I answered your question.
It's my impression that a lot of CEOs, their income depends on the share price. If the share price goes up, then they get more money per year or per quarter or whatever, and it goes down.
That's right, yeah.
So for them to be very close to asset managers is just very prudent for their own survival, their own income.
That's right, yeah.
With the world of the shareholders, but they want to maintain stable or increasing.
It's true, and there's questions about like how rational or irrational is this? Because if you're required to show a share price increase every quarter, you might do something in the short term that's really damaging, but the market's like. So, you know, and one thing that well documented, one thing that the financial markets really like is job cuts, austerity. So, you know, firms often engage in rounds of austerity when they need to boost their share price. So you can already see the political problems with this kind of system that empowers investors over every other kind of consideration. And yeah, and you're right, like the executive compensation is often tied to stock market performance. And even how we measure corporations now, like if you measure what are the largest corporations, you're not going to be getting measurements of like how much these companies produce or how many employees they have. It's what is their market capitalization? How much does the stock market think they're worth? That's how we measure the size of these corporations. So that's why, you know, Google and Apple are among the largest corporations because they have the largest market capitalization, but they may not be the largest. They're not producing the largest number of things. They're just, the stock market just likes them the most in that way.
I have a question. When you talk about the corporate form changing after the Second World War and this adding of more and more owners, one of the things that it makes me think of is I knew this guy who used to be the vice president of labor relations at Honeywell, and he talked about their strategy of tying the pension of unionized workers to the stock price of the corporation in order to make sure that everyone's interests are embedded in the stock price of the corporation, right? And I feel like we get a little bit of a kind of similar thing here where it's like, but the endowment is for you all. It provides bursary, like it, you know, and so we're this rising boat, you know, lifts all ships kind of thing. And I guess my question is, can you think of examples where all of those little owners that are not the big owners, but are the little owners where they mobilize, and have they actually had any success?
Yes, they have. So that's a great question. So it takes activists a while to figure this out, but eventually, like, and this sort of begins late 1960s, especially in the anti-war civil rights movement in the United States. Activists begin to think about how they can use this kind of system to their advantage, and they're particularly concerned about the corporations that are fueling the American war machine. Right? They're worried about the Vietnam War, and how can they put pressure on those corporations? And so eventually what happens is the emergence of a new shareholder activism movement. Like these are activists who, there's kind of in some ways the opposite of divestment. They actually buy a share in a corporation so they can actually then be active within it. And because share ownership is so widely dispersed, it's now much more accessible. Like you could just, for a small amount of money, you could buy a share in General Electric, for example, or Lockheed Martin, which both of which have been implicated in various crimes and various foreign policy misadventures and so on. So this becomes a strategy that's eventually codified in this group called the Interfaith. I think it's called Interfaith Coalition for Corporate Responsibility, and it's a group that starts with especially like among Catholic nuns who discover that their pensions are actually investing in some of these companies, and they begin. Well, if we're actually owners, like tiny owners, but owners nonetheless, we're going to go to the annual meetings for these corporations, and we're going to try to be active. Now, they have to experiment a little bit with this because obviously, if you're a small owner, you don't have much voting share, right? You have a tiny voting share, and it's going to be almost impossible to amass a voting majority on the kind of issue. But what they do is they start to connect their activism at shareholder meetings. They put forward resolutions condemning corporate behavior at these meetings, and they combine that with activism outside of the corporation. They create media campaigns, they have protests, and the combination of all of that has had some impact. And occasionally, and there's a group that still every year organizes shareholder resolutions on a whole wide range of issues, on issues related to climate, to unionization, to Indigenous rights. And their track record is not insubstantial. Like one of their successes is they did manage to reformulate a policy that Home Depot had around its sourcing of rainforest lumber. They didn't get everything they wanted to, but they did get a shift in that policy. And it occurred after about 6 years of going to the shareholder meeting, trying to raise a resolution there that would remove some of this sourcing policy. And they combined that with protests at various Home Depot locations and media campaigns and so on. So they have found a way to kind of combine the shareholder activism, their rights as small owners with other kind of campaigns. So I think shareholder activism would be the one practice there. But at the same time, the large corporations have found strategies to undermine that, to ignore them. And you probably know there have been campaigns around Palestine for some of these corporations, and those shareholders have just been removed from the room before they could table their resolution. So it's kind of a mixed story, but yeah, they have been trying to use the activist shareholder mechanism.
Yeah, here in the back.
Yeah. You say financialization is driven by, at least in part, by government policy. Yes. Do you think that there is been any recent resistance to this in government structures? Like Trump has been talking about reindustrializing and such and such.
Yeah.
Do you think that is going to stay in the rhetoric, or is there a real resistance to financialization that you think could be salient?
Well, there has been resistance to financialization, but it's come more from popular sectors, right? So you think about Occupy Wall Street and all of the echoes of Occupy. There's been lots of spin-off kind of activisms in different places that have tried to challenge that. There's a whole variety of local movements that try to challenge this kind of financialization. There's a local currency movement. The divestment movement is part of this as well, and so on. But in terms of government involvement or public involvement with the financialization agenda, it doesn't seem to have really weakened. There was some sense that maybe after the financial crisis of 2007, that would be a breaking point, or there would be a reconsideration. But for the most part, the status quo kind of remained. And if you look at various governments across the political spectrum, they're almost, they're very deeply tied into the financial sector. Look at there's been studies, for example, of all the American cabinets since Ronald Reagan, and all of them have had increasing participation from Wall Street. Obama's cabinet was full of Wall Street people. Trump's cabinet is the wealthiest cabinet in history. But Obama's cabinet had more Wall Street representatives than even Trump did. So across the spectrum, this kind of deep political connection between financial sector and the political elites is one thing that seems hard to break in some ways. So there is a resistance, but it's not happening at the level of governments just yet, I would say.
Do you think there's Like the way that the governments or Western governments are structured, do you think that inevitably is going to lead to greater financialization in the future? Just
Yeah, it seems though, I mean, there are limits to the financialization agenda as well. And so, like, where will we find the limits, I guess? And so some people, like some of the climate activists I know have argued that, well, like a climate reality is just going to force governments to abandon that agenda. So there are people who think that there will be limits, and I'm not sure about that, but it does seem at the moment that there are. We haven't found the limits just yet. There are some places where this is a bit of a digression, but there are places where governments are now experimenting with ideas to slow down the agenda just a little bit. So the idea of a wealth or a financial transfer tax, like there's a European Union-wide proposal for a tax on every financial transaction, like a tiny tax on every financial transaction, like just be a tax of like 0.1% of the value of each transaction. But because there's so many financial transactions and the volume is so high, that would slow down those transactions and it would generate a large amount of revenue that could be used then to compensate those who are harmed by climate change or other harms around the world. So there are some policies that are being debated like that, not in the American context or not much in North America, but in Europe there is some debate about that. Yeah.
So one of the strategies that people have been talking about in terms of how to pressure universities, right, to then pressure these financialized actors that they're invested in is adopting things like a negative screening policy. What are your views on that as a strategy for pressuring, institutions like universities? Do you think, like, what are the possibilities and limits, do you think, of those kinds of tactics?
Like a negative screen, it would just like screen out investments in certain.
Yeah, so that would be like directing it through a kind of ethical lens, right? Like screening out things that are ethically like dubious as part of your kind of, investment portfolio or something like that.
Yeah, like on one hand, I like the strategy because it's one that has been widely kind of experimented with. So if you, for example, invest in any kind of like ethical mutual fund, they almost always use a negative screen as well as a positive screen, like they'll screen in investments they think are ethically sound, so on, screen out investments in like arms manufacturing and so on. So it's useful in that way because it's a technique that a lot of fund managers actually use, right? There are fund managers who use it. So that the benefit of it would be like, oh, here's a technique that's easy and straightforward, and it's one that the industry already kind of knows about. That would be helpful. On the other negative side, critics of the negative screen point out that, well, if you're not screening out financial firms, then you're missing a lot because, like a lot of ethical investment in Canada, for example, invest in Canada's chartered banks because they're a good return on investment. But those banks in turn are spreading their capital to Palestine, to the climate to fossil fuel sector and so on. So I think it's a question of like how robust is that negative screen going to be, but it might be like a really interesting thing in the short term because it's a straightforward kind of technique and it's useful in some ways.
Yeah. About a decade ago, I think I went to my bank and said, okay, what about these ethical funds and what are they in? We went through all this stuff and I took that home and thought about it and looked up some stuff. It's really, really dense and really, really opaque. It's just, and basically this ethical fund, I'm not sure what it left. Well, it wasn't supporting mass murder, but basically it was, there's a lot of stuff in there that I just thought, no, I have no interest in this either. Because if something's in an index fund, for example, then there's just everything in there, and there's not really an easy way that I could see to either A, know it's there, and B, get rid of it. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, just like a complaint that a lot of like activists make is that this increasing financialized world like means that we're all asked to like take responsibility for our own financial future in some way, but it also means that the mechanisms that we use to do that are kind of beyond our control. Like we're asked to trust a mutual fund manager because we can't possibly understand the system ourselves. And yet, those experts failed to see the financial crisis of 2007 and like they make many mistakes. And yet they cobble together these funds on our behalf, and most investors are just completely passive in the face of that. So it does sort of, and don't like there's not even an easy way. There are groups that can help us learn about our investments, but for the sort of average investor, there's no obvious way to start that process.
Okay, this is a bit neat question. So when we were talking about large asset managers being primarily interested in long-term, I remember when the free trade movement was at its most active, or the anti-free trade movement, I should say, fair trade movement. One of the things that people argued was that corporations had shifted to more emphasis on short-term returns, and that it produced all of these problems. And so I was wondering from your research, do non-financial firms are they still locked in the quarterly report, or has that gone away? Because to me, it raises a question about their risks opposed to asset manager risks, like how they might bear disruption or sanction or targeting or something like that. And so I'm just wondering if productive, and I'm using it in quotes, or like one of the ones we targeted is Magellan, like they make stuff, right? And yeah, am I being clear?
Yeah.
Not an easy answer to the question.
Yeah, I think like that's a complicated question. I think that it seems like the longer term focus is starting to predominate a little bit more. And that's because these asset management firms are relatively new. Like they emerged in 1990s, but they've really grown since 2007 after the financial crisis. And they made the case that well, we are the long-term horizon. And this is also like what gave climate activists their entry point, because if you're interested in the long term, we can give you a long-term that's really committed on fossil fuels. So I think probably there is a shift in time frame is starting to become more important. But we're in this kind of contradiction where some of those public firms are still public firms, and so they need to report to the stock markets every quarter. There's a tension there, and I guess activists can, even climate activists I know have tried to think about where they could move to the short term versus the longer term. It's kind of complex. So they're trying to navigate that tension.
Okay. We only have 4 minutes left. So maybe what we should do is thank Rob for coming and talking to us. So thank you. So we go till 1. So folks can certainly go, but if we have this room till 1:30, so if you want to stick around and talk about the implications of what we've learned for organizing on campus, we can also do that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. There will be another teach-in at some point in the future that looks specifically at the U of A's investment portfolio and understanding what's in it. Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
You too.